then negotiates on.
Yep.
I mean, people
Okay.
joke about
We're live.
bankruptcy he's done.
Yeah,
But, I mean,
so a lot of
And
companies have done a lot of bankruptcies. I mean,
his
that's not-
business is worth a good amount too.
I mean, people can joke about that kind of thing, but one, that's normal. And then two, for like your average small business owner that goes under, that's just it. You just,
Bankruptcy is the end of a company, but it almost never is.
No, they
well, because
just
I think we
reorganize.
think of it as like the small, the
Yeah.
individual person.
Yeah.
Like I've been following Kodak for close to a decade, just because it's interesting to see how they're trying to continue making money, and they have dramatically changed their business model several times in the last 10 or 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
But I can still buy Kodak film. I have a bottle of Kodak chemistry right over there.
There was like that 3 or 4 month period where there was no Twinkies because Hostess was bankrupt.
Yeah.
And here we are.
I never think about Twinkies until I watch Ghostbusters.
Ghostbusters. Not the zombie movie.
Zombie movie?
Um,
Sorry.
save that for later.
We had.
What chapter are we doing today?
Oh, we're
Mike?
going to do Matthew 27. We're starting about 5 minutes. But we had a statue at work that was a statue of an eagle with its claws out, right? And it had been given to one of the people that I used to work with as a present or something. So we taped a Twinkie into its claws as if it had swooped down into a lake and scooped up a wild Twinkie.
Okay. Zombieland.
Oh, I haven't seen that actually.
That's a fun movie.
Well,
Look where I paused you.
you paused me with one eye closed, like
Because you were asking
That's the
zombie
guy that was-
movie?
Big
Yeah.
thing he wanted to find.
Did you find like a truck full?
Well, at the end, I think he found a bunch, but they had blown them up to get into the room where they were.
That's right. Yeah. I never watched the second one.
I hardly watched the first one. But
so. Our eagle Twinkie eventually did die because we didn't realize the package had been perforated, so it slowly mummified
No.
inside the package.
Which
So-
implies that it was up there for quite some time.
Oh, years, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, you could just replace the Twinkie.
It looked pristine on the outside, yeah, but it was definitely like a desiccated, mummified husk of a Twinkie. We did a lot of fun things in that shop.
I need a nap.
Need a nap?
So tired.
Well, we're just about to start Bible study, so
I fell asleep in my recliner, and I think it was like 3 a.m. when I woke up. And I realized Mac was sleeping on my bed, which,
I mean, if you're not going to use it,
well, the problem is I couldn't go to bed because if he sleeps on my bedding, then there's little fuzzies in my nose all night long. And so I washed all the bedding, the 2 quilts and the sheets.
yeah.
And I think it was like 4 something when I finally had the bed remade and went to bed last night.
Yeah.
I've been trying to move up my bedtime because this week, or starting this week, until the foreseeable future, my schedule will be morning times now.
Oh, right. And you're not a morning person.
We have not been successful at getting up earlier or going to bed earlier.
For me, yeah.
I mean,
Well, the question is earlier than what?
midnight.
Well, no, midnight's not earlier. Well, midnight is earlier. Midnight is
Yeah.
not late for me.
I know. It's late for me. Tomorrow's going to be a fun day.
Because I don't think I have my schedule just yet, but I'm pretty sure I'm working it with my first student at 10 tomorrow. So that means I need to be there 20 minutes before because I have to set up my laptop, my extension monitor, my headphones. I have a splitter now so that I can have headphones that are wireless and the mouse. Because when we did our practice yesterday, I had my monitor plugged in, I had the mouse plugged in, and then I ran out of USB ports. Okay.
Yep.
So
I have a thing with 4. So
we bought the splitter, and then so I have to set that up, and then getting student binders for anybody I might work with all day tomorrow and have that set up near me, and then open up all the files that I need and like running the programs that I need. And
Some things don't work through a
And then
splitter.
you still have to stay 6 feet away from each other.
well, we're not going to have students there.
Oh,
We're
okay,
doing
so it's
everything
all online.
electronic.
Okay.
So that's why I have to set up all
I
my
see.
computers and things
Right.
because us instructors are going to be at the center, but we're going to be separated from each
Yeah.
other. And
Yeah.
we're going to work directly with the student through, what's it called? Zoom,
Uh-huh.
because we have an account. We have 4 accounts for our center. So we'll just, when I show up, I'll be like, which account do I use?
Yeah.
And then we use that. And then everybody's supposed to have downloaded Adobe Reader so that through Zoom, we can see what they're working on and then the draw tools.
Cool.
So.
You know who else used Adobe Reader?
Who?
Not Jesus. And that is my segue into today's study.
Probably not Matthew either.
I don't know.
We don't really have.
He didn't write about
evidence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He didn't write about it, so we don't know. So, we're going to do Matthew 27 today, which is kind of a longish chapter, so we're probably not going to get to 28. Actually, I'm going to amend that. No, probably. We just aren't going to get to 28. But 28 is the last chapter, so we'll save that one for
It's very
next.
short.
It is very short, right? So, so yeah.
Any thoughts of what's next?
I don't know.
Okay. Just curious.
I kind of don't want to just roll straight into Mark because it gets to be pretty repetitive to do 4 gospels in a row.
Well, didn't we skip some of Paul's letters there too?
We might have.
So we could jump over, do one or two of his, come back to a gospel.
Yeah. Yeah. So I assume, we'll get into an epistle or something. But, all right. So last week we read about the plot to kill Jesus. We read about the woman that anointed him for burial. Read about the betrayal. Read about the Last Supper. Read about Peter's denial. Read about all the disciples falling asleep in the garden. Read about Judas betraying him with a kiss. Read about Jesus facing the Sanhedrin. Read about Peter's fulfilling the predicted denial. And that's where we pick up chapter 27. So chapter 27, when daybreak, because of course they didn't have the authority to put him to death themselves, right? Then Judas, his betrayer, seeing he had been condemned, was full of remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders. I have sinned by betraying innocent blood, he said. What's that to us, they said. See to it yourself. So he threw the money into the sanctuary and departed. Then he went and hanged himself. It's kind of very matter of fact, the way that's written.
It's one of those interesting things because I think I've heard pastors preach on it from both sides that, and the main question is Judas saved? Is Judas in heaven? And they've kind of used, I think, a combination of this passage where they've said both routes.
I don't really care.
Well, I would say at least before this, he definitely wasn't because of the whole "and Satan entered him" part.
Yeah, I mean it.
I would say that here maybe.
So I don't know. There's a lot of tangents you could go on there, right? But ultimately, I just don't really care because there's no point ever in the New Testament or the Old Testament where they go, God loves you just as long as you can sort out who's in heaven and who isn't.
Yep.
So to me, it's kind of like, yeah, sure, that's a question. It's not one that I'm going to spend any time on.
Well, it's the bigger problem to me is we'll just never know.
Yeah.
At the least, we see him showing remorse.
Mm-hmm.
But
and then how do you parse that? Like
we have nothing else to go on.
Yeah, there's plenty of people who aren't loyal to God, who aren't believers, who also show remorse.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, actually, the part I noticed, I don't not think has ever stood out to me before, is that so he had gone to the chief priest and elders and was like, hey,
Yes.
I'll tell you who Jesus is.
Yes.
That's sweet.
Yeah.
And here he just straight tells them, yeah, he's innocent.
Yep.
And the part I never noticed before, they just don't care.
Why
do
and
we care?
that's about to get really ironic in about 3 or 4, or maybe 5 verses. So let's actually continue on. Actually, it's going to get real ironic right now. The chief priests took the silver and said, it's not lawful to put it into the temple treasury since it's blood money. So they conferred together and bought the potter's field with it as a burial place for foreigners. Therefore, that field has been called Blood Field to this day. Then what was spoken of through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. They took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him whose price was set by the Israelites, and gave them for the potter's field as the Lord directed me. Okay. So the Jewish leadership comes off, in my opinion, just incredibly ironically several times throughout the whole trial and accusation and crucifixion narrative, right? So they're real concerned about whether or not it's lawful for them to keep the money, but they weren't concerned about condemning somebody who they all knew was innocent, right? I mean, they tried to find any charge they could that would stick in 26. And what they had to what they came up with, the only thing they could find that they could use as grounds to crucify him or to put him to death was that he claimed to be God, which is only a problem if he isn't God.
Well, yeah, but if from their point of view, if they're bound to determine that they're going to kill him,
right?
They're not going to admit
right
ever to themselves that, oh yeah, we're trying to kill God.
Well, of course not. Yeah. So, I mean, to them, it was a foregone conclusion that they had to kill him. And the fact that they're pretending to still be worried about the law and right and wrong is kind of laughable. It's very ironic to me. But it actually gets worse. Or better?
Well,
it gets cringier.
So see it from the other side. If they legitimately do not believe that he's God,
yeah,
just means that they just didn't notice all the miracles and all that other junk.
Right.
Then actually, it actually seems pretty logical to be worried about this. If they really think they're putting to death a heretic,
yeah,
which just means they don't know their own stuff.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing is, if they believed that, then it's reasonable. But how could they believe that after having seen the things that he did?
Yeah.
Especially with all of the way Matthew writes it and ties it so carefully back to Old Testament prophecy, it should have been obvious. I don't know, it was obvious to the disciples who Jesus was. It was obvious to lots of people. But even so, like, they knew he had not committed any crimes.
No.
And they knew that they didn't have the authority to put him to death, right? So how can they justify killing him? And how can they justify killing him knowing that he's innocent? And yet how can they also be concerned about blood money?
Mm-hmm.
Because is it still blood money if he actually is guilty?
Well, it's paid to somebody for essentially facilitating the death of someone else. I guess.
Yeah,
But what they mean by that.
but if from their point of view, that would be facilitating the death of a criminal, right?
Yeah.
Facilitating the death of a blasphemer who totally deserves to die. Why should that bother them?
No.
That's kind of what I'm curious about.
I think I heard somewhere where it talked about like the group of people that got thrown the money at were like the really high people that didn't go out. That every time they'd send lower religious people that would start to believe Jesus and be like, what are we doing? I can't do anything. And then they would send more like differenter people.
I mean, it's
each
a
encounter.
It's a reasonable speculation, but Matthew just doesn't say that clearly. But we did talk about that when we were talking last week about why did Judas have to betray him, and it seemed like the leadership either didn't know who Jesus was, or even if they did, could not allow themselves to be associated with it because of the recrimination from the people. Anyway, moving on. Verse 11. Now Jesus stood before the governor. Are you the king of the Jews? The governor asked him. Jesus answered, you have said it, which is curious because that's the exact same response he gave to the Sanhedrin, right? Mm-hmm. You have said it, yeah. And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he didn't answer, which is kind of, I mean, I could see somebody poking at that particular verse because he did answer one of their questions. And that's what they got him. That's why they decided he was a blasphemer, right? So when Matthew writes he didn't answer, he means he didn't answer about the everything else.
Yeah, he's not responding to the false accusations. He's only confirming who he is.
Right.
Well, here the idea is that the governor asks him the question, and he answers that.
Yeah.
But then all these other people that are there start making these accusations, and he
just
doesn't say
sits
another
there
word.
and lets it go. Yeah.
I think it's more the what's being asked, not necessarily who.
Mm-hmm.
But like we said last time, he can't. If he just blows holes in all their accusations, they're just going to end up letting him go.
Right.
Which can't happen at this point.
And we've already seen, half a dozen or so in just the last chapter, or last couple of chapters. We've already seen so many times that he said, as the scriptures say, the Messiah has to die.
Yeah.
Okay. Then Pilate said to him, don't you hear how much they are testifying against you? But he didn't answer him on even one charge, so the governor was greatly amazed. At the festival, the governor's custom was to release to the crowd a prisoner they wanted. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when they had gathered together, Pilate said to them, who is it you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Messiah? For he knew they had handed him over because of envy. And there's been lots of writing and preaching about this point, right? Pilate is stuck between a rock and a hard place. He knows Jesus doesn't deserve to die, right? But he also knows that he is screwed if they riot.
Mm-hmm.
Because he was on thin ice with his leadership. And if there had been massive public upheaval, then he would have been the one on the chopping block. And that's not going to work for him.
Literal chopping block.
Yeah. While he was sitting on the judge's bench, his wife sent word to him, have nothing to do with that righteous man, for today I've suffered terribly in a dream because of him. The chief priests and the elders, however, persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to execute Jesus. The governor asked them, which of the two do you want me to release for you? Barabbas, they answered. Pilate asked them, what should I do with Jesus, who is called Messiah? They all answered, crucify him. Then he said, why? What has he done wrong? But they kept shouting, crucify him all the more. When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that a riot was starting instead, he took some water, washed his hands in front of the crowd, and said, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves. All the people answered, this gets really heavily ironic. His blood be on us and on our children. Then he released Barabbas to them. But after having Jesus flogged, he handed him over to be crucified. Okay. So we talked about this a little bit before. The crucifixion narrative recalls the sort of tradition in Jewish religion of one particular sacrifice, right? The Passover. And it's heavily associated with the Passover, because what did they do just before this? They ate the Passover, right? It's Passover time. You know, we've been calling Jesus the Lamb of God for 2,000 years because of this. So it's heavily associated with Passover. It's also heavily associated with another one, the scapegoat, right? So the scapegoat tradition was that one of the two goats would be sacrificed and the other one would be released.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
So you have Pilate standing in on that with two people. One of them's going to be sacrificed in order to atone for the people, and the other one's going to be released, right? And that's exactly how Matthew, because you don't need Barabbas in this entire narrative, right? You could totally dispense with that guy. He doesn't have any lines of dialogue, right? If you were writing the stage play and you needed to cut 15 minutes to get it into a TV production, you would just cut this guy. But thematically, it makes a lot of sense because the sin of the nation was imparted to the goat that was sacrificed, right? Like that's kind of the thing there. The other thing about the whole Passover thing, what was the deal with the Passover blood? The Passover blood would be applied to all of the houses of the Jews so that they would be spared from judgment. Okay, so let's theologize about that a little bit. Who is covered by the blood of Christ?
Well, anyone that's saved, I suppose.
His elect.
Actually, everybody, right?
Okay.
Let me put this a different way. Who did Jesus not die for?
Okay. Yeah.
Right? Who would be disqualified on the grounds that, oh, sorry, yeah, it would be great if you wanted to convert. However, Jesus didn't die for you. So sorry, but you're going to have to find some other way. No one, right? The entire world is covered under that sacrifice if they choose to be. So it's highly ironic that the Sanhedrin people go and say, his blood be upon us and upon our children.
Yeah, I was thinking when you read it, I was like, if you just read it in the wrong context, you could read 25 and just be like, oh yeah, they get the point. Cool.
But I find this ironic, just like the, I'm not sure if it's written about this this way in Matthew, but one of the people in the Sanhedrin, I think it was the high priest, was like, I don't remember which of the Gospels it's in, but the priest goes, it's better that one should die instead of many. And the gospel writer specifically points out, like, he didn't realize what he was saying when he said that, right? So, I mean, you could get into a whole rabbit hole about who's covered by the blood of Christ, right? But suffice it to say, everyone is eligible for salvation. All they have to do is believe. All they have to do is accept God's salvation, right? No one is denied salvation on the grounds that Christ's blood cannot cover them.
Mm-hmm.
So I just find it highly ironic that Christ died for the sins of these people too. They don't accept it, but they said it right there, his blood be upon us and upon our children. And then they reject it.
And mine says all the people answered, his blood be on us. And not just the Sanhedrin, but all the people.
Yeah.
Who are witnesses there.
Did I misread that?
No, I don't think you misread it. I just think
Okay.
when you're talking
Well, you
about
may,
it,
yeah,
said Sanhedrin.
you said Sanhedrin, but
Okay.
it was really broader than that.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, you're right. It says that quite clearly in 25. I don't know where my brain went. Okay, moving on. 27. Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into headquarters and gathered the whole company around him. They stripped him and dressed him in a scarlet military robe. They twisted together a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and placed a reed in his right hand. And they knelt down before him and mocked him. Hail, King of the Jews! Then they spit on him, took the reed, and kept hitting him on the head. When they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe, put his clothes on him, and led him away to crucify him. And, Matthew doesn't give us like the specific passages that relates to, but there was this entire tradition of people who tried to make sense of Old Testament messianic predictions by saying there must be two. There must be one Messiah who's the conquering king, and there must be another one who's the one that suffers and is ridiculed and humiliated, right? Because they couldn't see how the guy who was ridiculed and humiliated could possibly be the guy who overthrew Israel's enemies and established the everlasting Davidic kingdom. It didn't make sense, right? They could not possibly see something like this, where you had the Son of God about to die.
Well, it's a pretty good movie plot if the guy doesn't die in the middle of it. Ridiculed, humiliated, by the end of the movie, you conquer.
Mm-hmm. Yep. As they were going out, they found a Cyrenian man named Simon. They forced this man to carry his cross. When they came to a place called Golgotha, which means skull place, they gave him wine mixed with gall to drink. But when he tasted it, he would not drink it. After crucifying him, they divided his clothes by casting lots. Then they sat down and were guarding him there. Above his head, they put up the charge against him in writing, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Then 2 criminals were crucified with him, one on his right and one on the left. Those who passed by were yelling insults at him, shaking their head and saying, "The one who would demolish the sanctuary and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." And we talked about this, like the whole thing about tearing down the temple and rebuilding it was all metaphor. He was talking about resurrection. He was talking about himself rising from the grave. And of course, they don't get it. In the same way, the chief priests with the scribes and elders mocked him and said, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him." So it's funny that they even admit that he saved others, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how did he save other people if he wasn't who he said he was?
I mean, they may just be, in their minds, referring to his healing or that
Yeah.
kind of thing. Well, because
Or sarcasm.
yeah. Well, I was thinking about the people that passed by and were mocking. They're like, Jesus has been around this area for 3 years. I mean, I find it hard to believe anyone knows who he is that doesn't also have some sort of first-hand experience with this guy.
Yeah.
The feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000.
Yeah.
All of his healing, all this other stuff that he's.
And that region's not that big.
Yeah.
No. Okay. I think we got to 43.
Yep.
He has put his trust in God. Let God rescue him now, if he wants him. For he said, "I am God's son." In the same way, even the criminals who were crucified with him kept taunting him. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over the whole land. About 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani?" That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of them standing there heard this, they said, "He's calling for Elijah." Immediately one of them ran and got a sponge, filled it with sour wine, fixed it on a reed, and offered him a drink. But the rest said, "Let's see if Elijah comes to save him." So the mockery is still going on. Jesus shouted again with a loud voice and gave up his spirit. Suddenly the curtain of the sanctuary was split in 2 from top to bottom. The earth quaked and the rocks were split. The tombs were also opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And they came out of the tombs after his resurrection, entered the holy city, and appeared to many. Okay. So obviously the highlight of this passage, well, there's a couple of them, but the big one that usually jumps out to me is the whole the veil in the temple getting torn thing, right? Who remembers what that was for?
That was the separation between the holy and the most holy
Right.
place.
Right.
And the fact that it ripped from the top to the bottom
Mm-hmm.
is significant.
Is significant.
And the fact that it was probably a few inches thick. It wasn't like
Yeah.
one of our curtains. It was very thick.
Right. This is not an accidental ripping. Right.
I like to picture some poor guy that had the duty to keep things up in the, keep up with the bread and make sure
Mhm.
the lamps are okay. And he's doing around doing his business, and all of a sudden he just,
Yeah. Yeah. Totally ruined his day. Right. Well, and imagine that guy goes out and, he goes to tell his boss, the curtain ripped. What do you mean the curtain ripped? The curtain ripped, like from top to bottom. It just tore in half. Okay, that's really funny. Just get back to work. The curtain ripped. It's exposed. What are we going to do?
Now, I do forget. Was that? I know there was one. Is that the place like the one day of the year the chief
Yes.
priest would go in? Okay.
So that's
Was there ever a part of the temple that they just flat didn't go into, or is it just
No.
just the one day?
so the high priest and only the high priest could go into that place once a year.
Okay.
That's the place where he would sprinkle blood
Mm-hmm.
on the Day of Atonement to atone for the sin of the people,
Okay.
to purge that holy place from the sin of the surrounding nation, right? Only now it's no longer cut off. Why is it not cut off?
Well, no, I was just wondering. Because I wasn't sure if there was like another inner part that they didn't go to. I knew about that with
Yeah.
just one guy.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
actually he went in twice. First he'd go in and atone for himself, and then he'd go in
Yeah.
and atone for. But I kind of think that the altar was no longer there. The ark was no longer there. I mean,
that is a
debatable.
whole nother tangent.
But if it wasn't, what did they do then?
I have a thing that I can, a podcast link that I can post for that, where a guy goes over the popular theories.
Jeremiah took it to Cleveland.
That's clearly what happened.
That's one of the theories.
Yeah.
Isn't that
It-
symbolic of
it's
the
some-
separation between God and man? Being,
Right, but
Well, that was the whole idea.
why did God and man have to be separate?
Because of sin.
Because of sin.
Right.
Yeah.
Except they don't have to be separate anymore.
Yeah. Because
Right?
Christ
Died once
covered
for
their
all.
sin.
Right.
All sins.
Because the blood of Christ really was applied to all of them and their children. Right.
Yeah.
So even the ones that rejected God, even the ones that were not believers, there is no need anymore for them to be cut off from God. The need to have a separation between what is holy and what is mundane doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
Right? It was done away with, and they don't get it.
Mhm.
So
So the sacrifice was sufficient for all.
mm-hmm.
It just only applied to those that repented and believed.
Well, yeah. I mean, you still have everybody still has the option to reject that status. But it's not something that they will be denied because God didn't give it to them. It's something that will be denied because they said, no, I don't want it.
Something I haven't considered before is the bodies of the saints that appeared to the people.
Yes.
I mean, it doesn't exactly say, but I'm just curious. I wonder what condition these bodies were in. I mean, when Lazarus came back out, it had only been 3 days.
It had only been
He
a short
still looked
time.
like just him at
Yeah.
that point. I mean, we talking like Walking Dead prophets that walk around? Because that would get people's attention.
What was traditional was that, Jim, maybe you can correct me if you
Yeah.
know more details here than I do, but the body would be laid in a tomb and would eventually decompose, and then the bones would be collected and placed in a box, and then that box would be stored. So when what was the guy who directed Titanic? Cameron, yeah. So when Cameron made a big stink of several years ago about discovering the bones of Jesus, what he had found was one of these traditional boxes that contained the bones of a man in some permutation of Joshua.
Which actually was a very common name.
Yeah, which was a super common name.
Yeah.
And this guy was married to somebody named Mary, I believe. And they said, see, there it is. It's the guy. And like,
Actually, some Mediterranean countries still do that practice.
Yeah. So I agree with you. Like, did some guys get out of some boxes? Because they're not big boxes.
No, I was thinking more like mid decomposition.
I don't know.
Walking out.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, either way, this is attention grabbing.
Yeah. Now, here's an interesting question. What passage does it make you think of?
Ezekiel.
Dry bones.
The Valley of the Dry Bones, right?
Yeah.
Well, it does say many. It doesn't say everything.
It doesn't say, it doesn't say everybody.
It's kind of non-specific.
Yeah. But to me, like it relates right back to Ezekiel because he had this whole thing about making these dead bones live, right? And then Jesus dies and the separation between God and man goes away. And then, oh yeah, here's some dead bones that are now living, right? Like Matthew is still pushing the Ezekiel button really hard.
Although I have something.
Yeah.
I always forget. But the interesting thing here, back before the death of Jesus Header, was talking about the two criminals.
Yes.
And then at the end of that section, it said that even the criminals who were crucified with him kept taunting him.
Yeah.
But in the other Gospels, it mentions about one criminal taunting and then the other one saying, "Remember me," or
Right.
whatnot.
Well,
None of that is mentioned here. It
so
just,
Matthew just doesn't.
skips through the last
Well,
words.
I kind of liken that to their sources and what framed, what was there. If you're listening, I know in the court of law they say that if you can get several eyewitnesses and none of them agree what they saw.
Yeah.
So Matthew could have a source saying that what they heard were the criminals. Maybe this source heard the one criminal yelling curses at him, but didn't really hear what the other guy said.
Yeah.
Well, and just because one of them repented doesn't mean that he wasn't previous to their mocking
That's my
yeah.
thought,
Jesus.
is that it's somewhere along the lines he has
Well,
something of a change of heart.
I just thought that Matthew maybe had a different focus than some of the
Well,
other
he
Gospels.
does that too.
Yeah. He wants to push the Ezekiel button.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and his we most look at it the idea that Matthew had the concept targeting a very Jewish audience.
Yeah.
Because
Mhm.
if he's pushing referring images from Ezekiel, it would have to be a Jewish audience that would recognize it.
Or at the very least, an audience that was familiar with Jewish literature.
True.
So the Venn diagram is going to be real close on those.
And even in the other ones, did it say that literally it was just the three of them crucified, or would there possibly have been more?
Off the top of my head, I don't know.
I've
But
never seen anything other than just the three.
It mentions 3, but
Yeah.
Because that could be the other thing, is there could have been more than just Jesus and the one on each side of him.
Yeah, it says that there was a criminal placed on his right and on his left, but it doesn't say that there was no one else.
So there
And
could
the Romans
be
were,
others.
the Romans were fans of mass executions.
So
and of course Matthew's going to write something that focuses on the point he's trying to get across.
Right.
Mhm.
He's not going to tell us everything that happened.
Yeah.
At that moment.
Yeah,
It's just the key.
Exactly. It's all there for a reason, because I mean it's like the Barabbas question. You could totally cut that guy from the script and he doesn't matter. Except if you do that, you don't get the image of the scapegoat.
And then there was a really neat movie made about it.
And then there was a really neat
The Road.
Say Mark and Luke both say 2
Yeah.
specifically. John probably said something similar, but
Yep.
no, I would just chalk it up to one guy later has a change of heart while he's there.
Yeah. Well, and the next verse, I think, says a little bit about that. In verse 54, when the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and the things that had happened, they were terrified and said, "This man really was God's son." So it's entirely possible, I think, that the other Gospels make a little bit more of this centurion's words, but it is entirely possible that one of those criminals realized, oh crap, maybe I shouldn't have said those things. Maybe he was exactly who he said he was.
Mhm. Well, now the confession was before Jesus died, because Jesus
Yeah.
was blind.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting with the way the guards do, there's a couple other times in Gospels that Jesus makes a comment that finding faith, greater faith in non-Jewish
In non-Jews, yeah.
Jews than Jews, like, for example, the centurion and his servant.
Yeah.
And he says, I don't find faith like this anywhere.
Yeah. That's true, because, I mean, the Romans present see something has happened and they pay attention to it. The Jews present, not necessarily.
Mhm.
And even one of the other two criminals figured it out.
Yeah.
I think some of a lot of the Hebrew folks were so tied up in their traditions, or as they call it, the oral law,
Yeah.
that they wouldn't let themselves see it.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
it's like
I mean, if you've ever tried to read the Talmud, you would get it's very tedious.
It's like we were talking before with the chief priest. If they really think they're executing a heretic, then it's perfectly reasonable what they're doing.
Mhm.
But they only get there by ignoring who Jesus is for 3 years.
Right.
Because they don't want to
Right.
believe who he is.
They have to discount all of the testimony about what he's done.
Mhm.
And they have to just assume that it's all garbage.
And then
You
they
know?
also have to
And the
admit how wrong they
prophecies.
are about a lot of things.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, Jesus was, in a way, threatening their very livelihood
That's true.
and their power and authority, especially the priests.
hmm
In the temple, they had a lot of power and authority.
Yep.
If this guy's right, we lose all our power.
They lose all their power. Yep. 55. Many women who had followed Jesus from Galilee and ministered to him were there, looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and Mary and the mother of Zebedee's sons. When it was evening, a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph came, who himself had become a disciple of Jesus. He approached Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Then Pilate ordered that it be released. So Joseph took the body, wrapped it in clean, fine linen, and placed it in his new tomb, which he had cut into the rock. He left after rolling a great stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were seated there, facing the tomb. So we're introduced to these two characters that we really haven't seen a whole lot from in Matthew's gospel.
Also, the other interesting thing is when in Matthew, they don't talk about the, like, no broken body, like the Old Testament history things that were,
Like the breaking of the legs.
yeah.
Yeah, Luke is much more descriptive of the crucifixion process. That I noticed that too.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Luke or Matthew just seems to be like, yep, they killed him. Here's the point.
Yeah.
Some account that to the fact that Luke being a physician,
Mhm.
whatever a physician
Yeah,
was at that time,
Mhm.
he would be more attuned to
Mhm.
finding out those kinds of things.
Do the other Gospels mention more detail of why the Joseph of Arimathea did the body movement at that
Yeah.
time?
So-
or
I don't remember which one, but one of the other gospels talks about how there's a scripture that says, "Cursed is everybody who hangs on a tree," and he wanted to get him down.
Well, and it was also because it was the Sabbath.
Right. And you had to do it
And-
before
and that was why they
because you
broke
couldn't do
bones.
it on the set. So they broke the bones to make them suffocate so they would hurry up and die. But Jesus was already dead. So Joseph of Arimathea and these two Marys are seeing this all happen. And I've heard it said before, and it's probably some kind of speculation, that the two Marys see Joseph bury this guy and go, yeah, you made a hash of it. We'll come back later. We just won't tell anyone.
Well, and because of the hurry, I think piecing a lot of things together, because
Yeah.
of the hurry putting it together, a lot of the ritual and traditions of
Couldn't
preparing
be
the
done.
body weren't done.
Yeah. So they have
One of
a
the
plan to
texts
come back later to
Yeah.
to make it right.
One of the texts have not only Joseph, but one other person, I'm not blanking, another leader
Hmm.
come with like 100 pounds of stuff
It seems like a lot.
for anointing the body.
Yeah. Seems like a lot, but I've never done it before.
But I've heard sermons about how they say, they dissed Joseph and this other guy because they were secret followers of Christ.
Uh-huh.
But my thought is because they weren't called out,
Yeah.
they were able to take care of the body and put it in the tomb.
Well, and that's an interesting idea, right? Because we have no idea how secret these people were in their following Christ, right? There was no Facebook or Twitter, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not like somebody emailed them and said, "Hey, Jesus is being accused before the Sanhedrin. You better get to here." Right?
Mm-hmm.
They find out the guy's dead. They go to the governor and ask for the body. They're not that secret. The governor knows who they are.
Well, I was thinking about that as you read it, that it's probably because this guy is rich and has some sort of status that he can approach Pilate
Yeah.
and ask for
Well,
his life.
in Mark, he's listed as being a respected member of the council,
Yeah.
which would be the Sanhedrin.
He can't be that secret because his tomb is now filled and not with him.
Right.
Well, and he also is wealthy enough to have a tomb.
Yeah. So, maybe he didn't make more noise when Jesus was being accused, but we also...
The thought is that the entire Sanhedrin probably wasn't there because it was late at night.
Yeah.
And so I can picture that they only called out, got a hold of the folks that would vote the way they
Go
wanted
along
to
with
vote.
it.
Well, and like we've said before, Matthew has a theological point he's making, right?
Mm-hmm.
We don't have the text of the conversation. We don't have a transcript of what was said. For all we know, this guy did say something. For all we know, he said, "This is wrong."
Yeah.
There's just no data, right? So I think calling him a shameful secret disciple is an argument from silence.
Mm-hmm.
But calling him, to try to argue that he would have stood up and done everything he could to prevent the crucifixion would also be an argument from silence.
Yeah.
So we just have to go,
Yeah.
well, what he did do was this.
Luke says he didn't agree with him, but that's all.
Yeah. Yep. Well, and, like we said before, Jesus needed to die in accordance with the scriptures, right?
Mm-hmm.
So...
Well, at one point he says, didn't he say that, you're not going to kill me, I'm giving up myself.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. Verse 62. The next day, which followed the preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember that while this deceiver was still alive, he said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' Therefore give orders that the tomb be made secure until the third day. Otherwise his disciples may come, steal him, and tell the people he has been raised from the dead. Then the last deception will be worse than the first." "You have a guard of soldiers," Pilate told them. "Go and make it as secure as you know how." Then they went and made the tomb secure by sealing the stone and setting the guard. Reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
It never occurred to me until just now that when they did this, they probably rolled the thing back and made sure he was there. Because this whole the common thing is, well, the disciples stole his body, which they're about to accuse him of anyway.
Yeah.
So, but this, what was that guy's name?
Which guy?
Joseph.
Joseph, yeah.
Guy with the tomb. He rolled that stone there himself. So they could have said, well, someone stole it before the guards got there.
Yeah.
But if you're going to seal this thing up, you're probably going to make sure
You kind of need to check. You kind of need to check, yeah. And that is it for chapter 27.
Actually, in John, the other person is Nicodemus.
Nicodemus?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And John says that Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly.
Well, not that secretly.
Well,
Not anymore.
not at that point, no. And it says, for fear of the Jews. And of course, quite often when in the Gospels and even in Paul's writings, when they say the Jews, they're talking about the leaders,
Right.
not all Jewish people.
Right. So there's, speaking of John, there's an interesting book that I've listened through called The Jewish Gospel of John. It's written by, I can't remember if it's written by a rabbi or if he's just Dr. So-and-so. But he argues that the term that is commonly translated as the Jews really means the Jewish elite leadership or the Jewish ruling class, right? Because it's not necessarily the term that would be applied to just any Israelite. And at the time, there could have been other words that might have been used. But that word was used and later gets translated as the Jews in other translations. And I think he says that in Greek the word was Judaioi or Judaioi, right? But this was in Judea. So if you're looking at it from a Semitic point of view, that would be like the Judeans, right? That wouldn't necessarily mean all Jews because there's lots of other regions.
Yeah.
But of course, Greek is not a Semitic language, and maybe they looked at it differently. I don't know. It's been a few years since I listened through that book. Now I'll have to give it another look and see about that when we get to John, because that particular writer tries to make a distinction between the Jewish leadership who was opposed to Jesus and the many Jews who thought there was something worthwhile in following Jesus. Because a lot of people take the Gospels, which deal pretty unfavorably with the Jewish religious leadership, and try to use that to paint all Jews and say, this is why they've suffered throughout history. But his point is he's trying to argue that you can't say that the Gospel of John is against the Jews in general because of how he believes that word is used and what he believes the context is behind it. So anyway, it's an interesting thing. I might post a link to the title of that book if I can find it again. Anyway, so we're done with that one. We'll do 28 next week. And we're starting Ezekiel 40 on Sunday. On Tuesday, we're starting Ezekiel 40 because it's Sunday today.
Yes.
And I totally know that and didn't just make that mistake. All right, let's pray and then we'll be done. Father, thank you that all of us are covered by the sacrificed blood. Thank you that all of us are made fit to be in your presence by the blood of Christ. Thank you that none of us were left out because we didn't come from, the people that you set aside thousands of years ago. Thank you that we were grafted in to be your people because of what Christ did. And we'll talk more about that next week, but we do want to thank you for that. Thank you also for the way you take care of us, despite the fact that things are weird. Thank you for allowing me to find toilet paper. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
And I will stop the stream.
And thank you for being a package of your toilet paper.
Oh, you're welcome.
I did, in fact.